It is now 10:35, and so I resume the hearing. Can I first of all just check that the time has been sufficient for everyone to read?
Well, as I read, we haven't got complete copies, but we've, and I'm not sure that the promoters have seen it yet, but it may be influenced by this point, other than some generalised points made about viability, which I'm going to ask Porter to deal with. What's in the bullet points is already in the meta statement. It doesn't set out anything new, and you've already got that in the meta statement. So.
Okay, yeah, I haven't undertaken that cross-referencing exercise, I must say, but hopefully then, Mr. Elvin, that should mean that it ought not trouble the council too much. I'm slightly concerned, though, that Mr. Butler and Mr. Natkus haven't had the opportunity.
So I'm quite happy to listen, and if a copy's on its way and it arrives in 15, 20 minutes or so, I can have a look then and we can pick it up. But I'm quite happy to listen and not delay any further, really.
Carol is circulating it electronically, just to confirm.
That's fine.
Sorry, Carol's circulating it electronically is the information I've got. So you should receive it by email shortly.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Bartle. So yes, just before I did resume, I just spoke with Ms. Fern to say that now that we have had it and have read it, we can, by and large, take it as read. So I don't want Ms. Fern to take up hearing time going through something that we've just spent time reading. So a very brief summary, a very quick canter through, and then I think Ms. Fern, you said that you wanted to focus first of all on the viability issue, at least in part because of the availability of your viability expert.
Yes, please, that would be great. Just one point, there is some additional information there on drainage, having received the documents on Monday. I appreciate that Mr. Elvin said that they're not being relied upon. However, there are a couple of references there on drainage matters that we've highlighted that are in addition to our previous evidence. I'll pass over to my colleague Sarah for a quick summary.
Thank you, sir. I'm not going to read this out. In terms of the sustainability, the critical thing was that the Greenbelt report never looked at what land was important in relation to any development. It only looked at what land was important in relation to existing development. That led to the allocation of the ST14 site as an urban extension in line with the original strategy of the plan, which would have created a much larger settlement, which would have been sustainable and which accorded with the council's threshold for large sites. Reducing the size meant it was no longer that size. It should have been knocked out at that stage, but the council failed to reassess it under their own criteria at the time, and later dropped their assessment size criteria conveniently to below the size for the site. It's not sustainable, this size. It can't be made bigger because of the constraints that the council have rightly identified. We don't think they're significant. The constraints have been identified sufficiently, but the constraints they have identified are rightly there. The developer is making a case for the increase in size of the site. Of course, it's not the purpose of the inquiry to improve the plan, but to determine whether it's sound in its current state. We think that due to the background of the allocation and the lack of clarity in the documents and the lack of assessment at the right time, that the allocation is entirely unsound. Going to the Greenbelt matters, the Greenbelt assessment falls far short of requirements. The proposed development will have a significant negative impact on the green belt. It is quite helpful that the council have lost the 2014 assessment, because even though that was a bigger site, it's I'm certain that it would have identified that there was a significant impact, and indeed there were sections of the council's assessment in the past which were significantly more severe on the allocation than a more recent one, which is very unusual. I think they lost the landscape assessment in between those two assessments, probably. The council highlighted some clear key views in their assessment of the heritage area of York City Centre. And they cited that in their Greenbelt documents in the Phase 2 sessions. This area is a really important area in those key views. It's just to the side of one of the critical key views from the Minster out towards the White Horse. The views will be changed hugely, and because of the height of Clifton Moor retail park buildings, it will appear that York simply extends beyond the ring road into the new settlement.
My apologies, Ms. Worthington. I didn't quite follow that point. Could you just repeat that one? I think it was about the buildings on the retail park. I
yes.
didn't quite follow. I didn't quite hear it, actually.
If you look at the aerial, the views I took from the top of the Minster, you can clearly see the Clifton Moor retail park, and you can also see the White Horse in the distance over the top of the retail park. And it's very clear that the site will extend the York urban area out into the Greenbelt beyond the retail park, and because of the height of the retail park buildings and the angle at which you view those from the Minster, you will see the new development as effectively an extension to the urban area with no gap. You can see existing buildings such as the Farmstead, which is 1.5 fields back from the ring road. That appears to be right beside the retail park.
Okay, so this is from the Minster.
Yes.
In effect, the retail park buildings hide the gap, is that?
Absolutely.
And you would see the buildings on the side.
Absolutely.
I understand.
And because of those, the angles we're talking about, trees would actually have to be extremely tall to stop all the roofs forming that massive roof work that would just look as though it's part of the urban area with no break. And that would be urban sprawl and contrary to the NPPF in terms of greenbelt purposes. The greenbelt also hasn't been properly assessed, not only the site itself, but the impact the development will have on the surrounding area. That hasn't been properly assessed in the council statement, partly because it doesn't consider all the excess elements to the site. Now we're seeing that lots of public open spaces goes beyond the development limits of the 55 hectares. There's the access road and the street lighting. This will all add to the urban sprawl, connect it to existing development, and be very detrimental to the greenbelt purposes for the surrounding land. The council themselves admit that the southern boundary fails to meet the requirements of the NPPF, but they don't comment on the areas that fail to follow any boundary at all on the east and western boundaries, where an arbitrary line through a field has been chosen. This doesn't even follow historic field patterns. This is contrary to the MPPF, which requires clear boundaries to be set at the present time, and therefore the allocation of the boundaries are contrary to the MPPF. Paragraph 85, last bullet point, requires us to define boundaries clearly using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent. The council has accepted that there aren't any in places, and the developers have said you could do that boundary or you could do a different boundary, and we're going to put stuff beyond the boundary anyway, so it doesn't really matter. That's not how we define greenbelt boundaries. Going on to flood risk and drainage, we've had a few reports given to us on Monday, which was very helpful, by Mr. Butler. Those were copied to the programme officer in response to our request for the raft of documents which we asked from the council last week. In those, the arboricultural assessment, paragraph 2.7, mentions that the site is, the land is slowly permeable and seasonally wet, with the north-eastern section being naturally wet. We've also got the geophysical survey that says it's waterlogged in places. The drainage report was a desk-based analysis. We've got someone with drainage expertise on the developer side, but we've had no evidence. Our client who lives next door says that there's a real drainage problem, and the problem this has is viability and impact, and that's drainage.
Okay, yeah, so I've just been reading about this, so I don't need you to tell me about it.
And then on the viability, we've obviously written some points down there, and it's also worth noting that there's no allowance made for the purchase of all the additional land around the site for the landscaping, for the drainage, and for the public open space. Absolutely no amount of money has been put in the assessment for the purchase of those that area of land. If I was a landowner, I wouldn't give that to the council for nothing. The developer, yeah. This completely blows the viability out of the water and makes it undeliverable in terms of viability. We therefore suggest that if the plan goes ahead with this allocation, it will be unsound. It's certainly unjustified. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Worthington. Yeah, perhaps because I know that you are going to be keen to today, perhaps if we explore the viability issue in detail. Now, that's you, isn't it, Mr. Myers, I think? And you're keen to get out of here and go somewhere else. So perhaps if we take that now.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, just try and keep it as brief as possible, conscious that the paper's been shared. I think the conclusion from the viability technical paper, that's been submitted by the council recently would be, to me, that the site isn't proven to be viable or deliverable. And I'll come back to some of the detail of that. I'd like to just, first of all, pick up on a point that's been discussed at some length already this morning, and that's the gross to net of the site. There's an assumption of 70% gross to net, and I would say for a large-scale site, that's extremely optimistic. Normally you get more towards 50-50 once you allow for the areas that are non-developable, ecology, common infrastructure, drainage, and the like. And so the effect of actually a more realistic site density would be to lower the number of homes on the allocation. And the impact of that in terms of viability in what is a moderate to high value location would be to lower the land value. Now, I think we've already heard a concession this morning from Mr. Butler, unless I misheard, that actually they see a gross to net of 60% being more appropriate, and a dwellings per hectare of 32, which already takes the number of dwellings down to just over 1,000 from the figure that it is at the moment. So you'd expect that to have a corresponding impact in terms of lowering the land value, and that's a really important point for what I'm about to now say, and that is that the council's viability evidence actually demonstrates that the site is unviable. I think in the technical note it specifically shows the residual land value of the appraisal that's been modelled to be below the benchmark land value. The technical note states that that is marginally viable. However, I would assert that that is unviable in accordance with national planning practice guidance on viability, because effectively the total development costs of delivering the scheme, inclusive of the land costs, are higher.
I don't have it, forgive me, Mr. Master, I don't have it in front of me, I'm just about to pull it up, but if I recall, it's something like -9 per dwelling, isn't it?
Correct, yeah. And no doubt the council will argue that there is tolerance within the benchmark land value. I would also assert that there isn't actually a great deal of tolerance for a number of other reasons within the appraisal. I think the other point is that, you know, there's been no sensitivity analysis done on that. So the council's evidence says it's marginally viable. I would say it's unviable. Our ICS guidance on financial viability and planning dictates that there should be a sensitivity analysis to illustrate the impact of small variations in cost and value. And as I think many in the room will be aware, you know, there is potential for huge variation in the refinement of design process that can lead to small variations, small adjustments that can deliver a very different answer. There's been no sensitivity analysis that's been done. I think just moving on, I think probably the biggest weakness in this viability appraisal is a lack of proper site-specific strategic infrastructure and abnormal development costs. You know, for a large-scale site, you know, what we've seen in other local plans and in strategic sites in local plans that have failed to get off the ground is the absence of proper site-specific technical information about site development costs at the plan-making stage. And I think we do have that case in point here as well. The sort of cost headings that you need to understand to really get to the bottom of viability are, you know, what the strategic highway costs are, what the earthworks costs are, what the drainage costs are, what the strategic green infrastructure costs are, what the utilities reinforcement costs are. None of that exists in the appraisal. There is an allowance for site opening costs, which equates to about £21,000 per home. And I would say that that's woefully inadequate based on typical benchmarks for the costs of opening up a large-scale site. We have included within the submission the evidence that is still referred to, which is the local housing delivery group viability in local plans from 2012. That indicated a range of 17 to 23 grand a unit. You index that to the current day, you get figures ranging from 28 to over £30,000 a unit. So I would conclude that is a significant omission and lack of detail, and as a result, we cannot say that this site is viable and deliverable. And I would say, based on those allowances, it's very unlikely to be viable and deliverable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. Yeah, just picking up on a point that you made there. So I think you're saying, I don't know if there'd be any disagreement from Mr. Porter on this, that viability appraisals are sensitive to the assumptions that go into them, and relatively, what might on the face of it at least appear like relatively minor tweaks can have significant effects one way or the other. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct, sir. And no doubt you'll be aware of the current inflationary pressures on the construction industry that in particular necessitates in planning and viability that sensitivity analysis is done. You should not take viability right to the limit in terms of land that's allocated or policy standards that are set. There needs to be a buffer to insulate the effects for possible changes and variations in cost and other assumptions.
Okay, I think just to help Mr. Miles, I think I want to focus on the viability issue first of all. Should I look directly to Mr. Porter? Mr. Porter.
Thank you, sir. There's a few points that are picked up there, but I suppose if we're talking from the same hymn sheet here, Mr. Miles has...
hopefully you are. You're both viability experts,
yeah.
So hopefully you've at least been to the same choir school.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you, sir. And the big thing here, I suppose, is the context, firstly, for viability that's been raised about the level of detail that's required. He has quoted quite extensively in his own notes from the Harman Guide, which is a sponsored guidance for the NPPF 12 from looking at viability, sponsored by CLG at the time, as well as the MRTPI. And it's quite clear in that piece of work, if I can bring up my own notes on it, but it's that there needs to be a broad agreement on assumptions, i.e. it's high level, broadly testing that the cumulative policies within a local plan does not threaten its delivery. It does not require a very detailed analysis of viability on a site-by-site basis, because that's just something that you may do through development management tools. And also, it would be just impossibly too long. I think you start to lose the wood through the trees on what the purpose of viability a local plan is, if we refer to, if we go along with what Mr. Miles is saying about this specific site. So for that, we have tested this site at various stages of the plan-making process, going back to 2014, but then also more recently in the we've been referring to throughout this whole plan, CD018. And the site at that stage was identified to be very viable. We also did some update on costs and values, again to show that the site is viable. And then we've looked at more further detail on the site to understand what the infrastructure costs, the phasing, the trajectory, everything else would do. And this site would still become what is called broadly viable. The NPPF does refer to what is developable. And developable means it has a reasonable prospect that the site is available and could be viably developed at the point envisaged. I don't think a loss of £11,000 on this site would deem that site unviable to come forward throughout the whole site. So that's just sort of sets in a context on what viability assessment of local plans should be doing and looking at. He has raised some other points about sensitivity testing, and he refers to a recent RICS guidance that's come out, which relates more to the NPPF 2019. But even so, it does refer to some sensitivity testing. And he has mentioned the impact of costs on sites. And I think that's probably one of the key ones that most around the room would be looking at the moment in terms of what would happen if costs were to rise. So, in fact, I'm going to talk about it as well. If you need the evidence, I can provide it. But what I have done, I've looked at the impact of what is the projected rate of cost growth over the next 5 years. And this data has come from RICS, which I presume we're both members of, and the Building Cost Information Service. And that has identified quite a substantial cost growth for development over the next 5 years, around about 27%. What we need to also consider in sensitivity testing is the impact of sales values and what's likely to happen over the same period. So,
apologies, the impact on what did you say?
Sales values, because it's sales, yeah, in terms of residential sales, because it is dynamic, and every month it will change. But at the moment, we have to rely on current costs and current values as set out in the Harman Guide that Mr. Miles has been extensively referring to. But even so, as a sensitivity test, I did have a quick look at what would happen in 5 years' time if we were to undertake this work again. And based on the RICS guide on, build costs, 27% growth is anticipated in impact of build costs, mostly relating to price rises in materials. At the same time, I've referred to what might be available in terms of projected sales values, because we need to look at both in unison to understand the proper impact on viability. And I referred to the OBR house price projections for the next 5 years, which refers to an 18.2% growth. I've also looked more detailed, try and get something more local, and the closest I've found is a Sarrel's report on residential price projections for the north, which is anticipated to grow at a higher rate than the national average because of London is not doing so well. But in the north, the projection is for 22.5% growth, less than build cost. But when you apply the base cost to those percentages, build cost is less than half of what sales values is. So you can imagine the impact on viability is actually a substantial improvement. Over the next 5 years, the amount on viability on a per house basis is likely to increase up to about £50,000. So if we were to sensitivity test that, and I can demonstrate that and show that, that would be the actual impact. Another point that was raised, and it's been raised in his submissions as well, is relating to opening up costs. And he says that we're fairly light on that. I'll be honest with you, in my own experience, for this size of scheme, I don't see 17,000 as being light. If anything, maybe overcosted. But what's probably more relevant, which has failed to be mentioned, is that the opening up cost of 17,000 is in addition to the other opening up costs of it bringing infrastructure to the site to open up that site, the access cost of that site. That is being tested at £29,000 per unit. So on top of 17,000, we've got an additional £29,000 per unit. Not only that, we have phased the costs, that open up cost of 17,000 before development even starts. The reality is, those open up costs, which will include spine roads, it will include some open spaces, will be phased throughout the development. It will come later than what we've even projected. So our recent analysis, which is showing that it is still viable, I would present to be a worst case scenario of that valuation.
Yeah, so I'm just going to take a pause while things settle down outside. Doesn't make for good TV, I know, but Mr. Miles.
Yeah, just to respond, sir, I think just on the principle of it being okay at the local plan because that's what we do, because it's broad brush and that's fine. My reading and interpretation of the shift as embedded in the 2019 NPPF and the associated National Planning Practice Guidance on viability is that actually we're moving towards more detail at the local plan viability stage and less at the development management stage. I would also kind of emphasise that my interpretation is that where a plan has a particular dependency on a site because of its scale, there is the need to get into proper detail on site costs, not high-level allowances. And I would again highlight the pitfalls of other local plans where they have depended on large-scale sites which haven't got off the ground. I think, in relation to the sensitivity analysis, I think I would just say, I think that needs to be demonstrated, that needs to be put in front of you. It's not been put in front of you. I'm not sure I agree with Mr. Porter's numbers in terms of how things will change, but with the benefit of seeing that sensitivity analysis, I'd welcome the opportunity to comment on that. I would very strongly challenge the assertion that 17 grand a unit is overcosted for a large-scale site. I mean, I'm not sure on what planet you deliver a large-scale site with a strategic opening up infrastructure and abnormal cost for £17,000 a unit. I noticed other people around the table trying to avoid eye contact at that point because it seems completely unrealistic.
Mr. Miles,
I want to pick up on that in a moment.
Well, Mr. Miles, also to bear in mind that you've got to add 29 to the 17. It isn't just 17.
That's the point I was going to pick up on.
Well, just on that, I mean, my reading of the appraisal is at £21,000 a unit, and if I've misread that, I'm happy to be stood corrected. But in the document, and there's no page numbering, but the appraisal at the back shows a site opening at cost of 21,590 per unit.
So I can clarify where that is. So I believe Mr. Miles is probably, as he should be, looking at the development appraisal in the Appendix 1 of the Council's Note 99B, which there's rows 4.6.2.1, which covers transport infrastructure, which does include the link roads to the site to open the access to the site.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr. Porter. Mr. Miles, could I just ask you to pop your microphone off? It makes the sound go funny when someone else is using it. Mr. Porter.
So, sorry, yes, so it's in the appraisals I could actually just make reference to the rows. There are 4.6.2.1, 4.6.1, and so there's 3 items that are identified, which are sum to 29,000 per unit, and they cover the transport access to the site. They cover community education uses that would be part of the wider strategic open up cost for a greenfield site. And they also include a bit of a catch-all assumption of another £4,000 a unit, probably a bit of duplication on some of the other elements, but even so, we did err on the side of caution in our work, so we've included another 4,200 per unit for other costs. On top of that, we've then got the £17,000, which will pick up any other potential costs which aren't going to be so substantial on the site that's already been opened up. So it'd be to bring in utilities, it'd bring in a spine road, and to address drainage issues on site.
The point that I just wanted to put to you, Mr. Miles, you mentioned the broad brush approach. Tell me if I get this wrong. The broad brush approach that Mr. Porter described being something that one would associate with the 2012 MPPF rather than the 2019 one. As you'll be aware, I'm examining this plan under the 2012 NPPF, so I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
The point is noted.
May I come back on just on that point, sir?
Please.
Paragraph 173 requires that to ensure viability, the costs of any requirements likely to be applied to development, such as requirements for affordable housing standards, infrastructure contributions, or other requirements should, when taking account of the normal cost of the development mitigation, provide competitive returns. So we've got everything covered in that paragraph of NPPF from 2012 that the viability should look at, and it should provide competitive return to a willing landowner, it says there. So it is important that the land value is at a reasonable rate. I'm just wondering whether this extra £29,000 that the opening up cost also includes payment for the extra land outside the 55 hectares is provided for in that, because it doesn't seem to be provided for elsewhere, and presumably that does need to be bought. Thank you.
Do you take any issue with, I think, what Mr. Porter has described as a broad brush approach? I mean, I know that you said that you have looked at, I don't mean to mischaracterise, that's all. I know that you would point to the additional sort of detail that you've looked at in your most recent note, you say. In terms of that as a general approach, is that something that you take issue with? I already have what Mr. Miles said about it. I wondered if the planners on this side wanted to say anything.
Yes, please. That's something that I've looked at quite closely. If, for example, the site was coming out at green and was extremely viable, as I'm sure some sites have been within the York local plan, under a broad brush assessment, I wouldn't necessarily expect any more detailed assessments be provided. I would almost be happy to accept that that would be dealt with through the development planning process. Given that this site comes back as marginally viable, I think that's a good case to suggest that more detailed assessment needs to be undertaken. This site is the second largest site within the local plan. It's proposed to bring forward a considerable amount of York's housing requirements, and therefore it needs to be demonstrated as being viable.
On the viability point, is there anything else from this side that you wanted to tell me? What I'm going to do really is kind of like hear your final points on viability. I'll hear, hopefully reasonably briefly, from, well, I was going to say Mr. Butler. They've all got their nameplates up. Hopefully I don't have to hear from you all. And then I'll hear from the council. Mr. Miles.
Well, first of all, just to acknowledge those are the lines in the appraisal around education costs and other section 106, which...
Forgive me, I didn't catch that. My fault entirely.
Sorry, you didn't catch what I just said, or you didn't catch the right. First of all, just to acknowledge that there are other lines in the appraisal which do set out other strategic infrastructure costs, so just to acknowledge that. But I think the main point remains, and that is that the lack of clarity and detail as to what the elements are that make up the necessary site opening and infrastructure costs, those are missing. And notwithstanding your point of the slight nuance of difference between 2012 and 2019 in terms of the MPP, if there's still the need to make sure that we have clarity over deliverability of such a large-scale site, given its importance to the overall local plan's delivery. I think I just wanted to reiterate to make sure the point was that my colleague made was understood, that there is another element which does significantly impact on viability, and that is that there is a lot of the site's strategic infrastructure in terms of drainage and public open space is outside the boundary. and that is not allowed for within the appraisal in terms of the costs of land acquisition or any costs associated, as I understand it, for equipping that, because the land value in the appraisal is assumed to be predicated on the allocation area of 55 hectares. But actually, if you need quite significantly more land than that outside the boundary to provide for that other public open space and other infrastructure, then you need to have a bigger amount of land. You've effectively got to buy more land. So that the impact of that is that the benchmark land value is higher, and that moves the residual land value lower against that reference point.
Probably going to regret asking this, but I'm going to anyway. The additional land that you've just referred to, would that have a housing land value?
It would have an equivalent benchmark land value. The approach to benchmark land value is not a housing land value. It is a value that is struck between the existing use value and the market value of the land.
Okay, thank you for that. Was there anything else from this side on viability? Because I'm going to go to the other side of the table. I'm not going to come back. So as long as you've told me everything that you'd hoped and dreamed you could, then I'm happy. Good. Yeah, I'll take Mr. Porter, despite what I said a moment ago. I'll take Mr. Porter first, and then I'm hopeful that some of the nameplates at the end of the table might disappear.
So if our heritage and landscape witnesses start talking about viability, I'll be more shocked than you. So I think they were up from earlier when we were doing the previous order.
Yeah, okay, sure. Mr. Porter.
Actually, just very short, but on the additional land value, there's been quite a lot of debate about this, and its value really is only going to be its existing use. It's not developed. It's going to be a really minor cost if you want to look at it. Even if it's 100 hectares, you'd probably know another 2 million maybe at most. It's something that just gets eaten up within all the assumptions. One other thing to note is that the viability work we've undertaken does include a contingency allowance as well. I haven't mentioned that, but that was assessed at 5% of the overall build cost. So it's got a lot of other sweep up within it. So I think from a broad...
My apologies. Did you say a contingency of 5%?
Yes. Which for this sort of work is probably not needed because costs could be higher or lower. It's high level, it's broad, but we still allowed it, but just in case. So there's quite a lot of scope for sweeping up anything that we can't, this level of work is never going to go to the detail that it's been suggested.
Okay, I would say, Mr. Natkus, I am on the cusp of having heard enough on this point, but please.
Don't worry, sir. It's just a very quick point just on the generic nature. And I think from listening to the debate, the concern from the other side of the table is that there's insufficient detail, particularly on this side. But I think the council have to be consistent. So if it was considered that further detail was needed, that would have to apply to all sites. It would be totally unreasonable to say that this site's elevated above all others to have further viability work done. I think all sites would have to go through it. So there has to be a consistent approach, whether it's, for want of a better phrase, broad brush or detail. I don't think it's right to start taking one site out to a higher level of scrutiny, and I've never seen that anywhere else, to be honest. The other quick point, just to mention as well, was just on sites not getting off the ground, which you were told a couple of them hadn't been, and they weren't referenced as to which they were, but just to give you two comparables, Skelton Gate in Leeds, large greenfield site, edge of Leeds, currently being developed now, which came through from their local plan, and in Harrogate, their new settlement, 4,000 homes, the DPD's out, and that's progressing with an application at the moment in accordance with it. So comparable sites like this have come forward. Other sites may be not coming forward, but the ones that I'm guessing have been referred to are probably the ones in Kirklees that are large brownfield sites, very different to this.
I'm going to hold you there. Well, in fact, I'm going to stop you there because I don't want to get, frankly, into other sites. It's pretty clear to me that there may well be significant differences between this site and the sites that you're talking about, not only in terms of the nature of the site, but the type of developer, all kinds of things that go into these sorts of appraisals could be wildly different to the sort of thing that we're looking at here. So, frankly, I don't think it's going to be very instructive to me. Mr. Butler.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep this brief. Just to follow on from what Mr. Natka said then, the information being requested is akin to what you'd usually submit as part of a development management process with an application if you weren't going to deliver the policy requirements. That's not the case here. We're fully meeting the plan's requirements and from a policy point of view. So the level of information provided, as Mr. Natka was saying, is proportionate given where we are in the process. Just to quickly come back on the net point that was made earlier, we can deliver at the 70-30 net. The issue I'm referring to is more the density of the development in there. We can do 35 dwellings per hectare. We've not disputed that. We can deliver the site as it currently stands in the plan. The costs shown are indicative and worst case, and in the latest note, they are broken down into specific elements in terms of access roads and junctions and bus enhancement. We know from the work we've done that we think those costs, as Mr. Porter said, are worst case. They're indicative. It leads you to the conclusion of £9 per plot deficit, which is £12,000 overall, which in the scheme of things is nothing. But on the basis of the work we've done, because those costs are worst case, the site is clearly viable. And linked to that point is the site is being promoted by a national house builder. There are a variety of other national house builders seeking to deliver this site, 4 to 5 in total. It is clearly viable, and they're making that proposal based on their own internal work they undertake prior to making bids on the land, based on the policies in the plan, not just the policies that are currently in the published plan, but the amended plan as it moves forward. There is no issue with viability here at all, and we're very, very keen to get on and start building the site. Last point, to do with whether the value of land outside the red line is taken into account in the work we're doing. It is, as has been stated, on the benchmark land value basis. That work is considered as a part of our wider work, so we are 100% certain, as we can be as we sit here today, that the site is viable and deliverable.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on then from the viability question.
I've got a few things I want to add, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course not, Mr. Robert.
And Laura's got something just to add very briefly. Can I just draw your attention to the fact that although Mr. Miles referred to the RICS planning guidance, this ties in with what's been said. The RICS planning guidance refers to the proportionate testing at the plan stage of sites and typologies, 3.3.10 figure 2. Secondly, even if you take the up-to-date NPPG, it also takes a proportionate approach. That's paragraph ID 10 003 2018 0724.
Sorry, I was with you up to 003.
2018 0724. Does not require individual testing of every site or assurance that individual sites are viable, so it's a proportionate approach as well. Even in the cases of sites on which the delivery of the plan relies, it is not mandatory, it just says may be necessary. So even the up-to-date guidance isn't as rigorous as Mr. Miles was suggesting. And indeed, we have provided through Mr. Porter detailed assessments of the strategic sites anyway. Ms. Bartle had one.
Yeah, it was really just to connect all that has just been said to the evidence of our infrastructure requirements and the latest information that's been submitted, particularly draw your attention to CYC 79, which was the phase 2 infrastructure note, which makes the point in terms of the conservative and worst case costs that have been applied, but also at Appendix 1 to that document provides information relating to those site-specific elements that have been fed into the viability testing that you've heard information about from the council's side. So it was really just to connect that evidence chain, really.
Yeah, very briefly, Ms Worthington, because I want to move on from the viability point.
I'm really sorry. It's just that Mr Elvin drew your attention to the paragraph which states plans do not require individual testing of every site. If you scroll down 2 paragraphs from that.
So is this in the PPG?
Yes. So the paragraph reference under the paragraph I'm citing is paragraph 5, ID 10 hyphen 005 hyphen 2018 0724. That says it's important to consider the specific circumstances of strategic sites. Plan makers can undertake site-specific viability assessment for sites that are critical to delivering the strategic priorities of the plan. Which I think says it all. It carries on to say what you need to do.
Okay, thank you.
2 points. It says could. It doesn't say must. Secondly, that's just what I said if Ms Worthington had listened to me with regard to paragraph 3, which says it may be. Secondly, we've done it anyway. And we've done it in a proportionate way, in accordance with general requirements. The problem is you're being asked to do effectively a development management assessment here, which is not appropriate.
Okay, I've heard enough, frankly, on the point of viability. Bear with me one moment, please. Yeah, I've heard a number of other points from this side of the table, and I'm conscious that I haven't given the council, as yet, an opportunity to respond to those. So should I ask you to do that now, Mr Elvin?
I'll do that, and we'll also comment on the boundaries in a moment. So the difficulty with the case that's been advanced against the site allocation is it simply doesn't grapple with the detailed material that's been put in. And I'm going to give you some familiar references. The context in which the sites were assessed, as you know, and I've said this many times, is in the the sustainability appraisal, core document 9A. The methodology is set out in Appendix G, as you know, and I took you to this yesterday. The strategic assessment in the essay is at volume CD 9B. PDF's pages 114 to 132, where it balances all the various factors, including landscape and other assessments. And the internal page numbering, it's page I95 to I113. As I say, PDF 114 to 132. The historic impact assessment.
Yeah, just to help everyone out from here on. I should have done this a while ago, and I don't know why I haven't. But I think just the PDF references are going to be sufficient for me because, frankly, yeah. I do use the electronic copies.
Yeah, fine. And then the 2017 historic heritage impact assessment, SD 102. PDF 98 to 111, which sets out the then English Heritage's points about the site. Finally, the green belt assessment, which is not touched upon at all by the objectors, 59, CYC 59G, PDF 25 to 40. And then finally, my favourite appendix in the sustainability appraisal, Appendix K, which is the audit trail through the various stages of the sustainability appraisal, which explains why the site was pulled back from the ring road and why the alternative that was chosen was considered to be suitable, and matters changed over time. It's Appendix K, and I'll give you the PDF number. Lord. Yes, it's PDF pages 369 to 370. And you'll see the changes occurred, as many of them did, at the preferred sites consultation in 2016. I should point out, when you look at those documents, it's not views from the Minster which count. I mean, if you stand on the Minster Tower, and I seem to remember being very out of breath last time I went up there, it's quite tricky, it's worse than Durham, and that's saying something. It's not the views from the Minster, it's the views of the Minster, it's the setting of the city that counts, and you'll see that in the sustainability appraisal and in Historic England's comments and in the strategic policies. If you look from the Minster Tower, well, you can see Monk's Cross and all sorts of things, and that's not the test. In terms of the sliver of green that will be visible above the retail park and the allocation, well, firstly, one needs to bear in mind that the view's the wrong way round, but secondly, that there's a requirement for buffer and landscaping as well. So even the assumption that's being made by looking at those photographs from the Minster Tower is not necessarily one that will remain a good point when the application goes in. Jane?
Thank you. You've just covered off most of the things that I had on my list. Just let me check what's remaining from those. I'll just touch on the boundary point, and if there's anything further we can come back. As I said previously, the boundary is considered to be recognisable and permanent along the eastern, western and northern edges, but it's recognised that that's not the case along the southern boundary. That is a consequence of moving that boundary north to set it back from the outer ring road. And as has already been mentioned, that was about the setting, providing that rural hinterland to the main urban area of York. There isn't an obvious location where a recognisable and permanent boundary can be created in that location. So one that has been chosen, it broadly aligns with the southern extent of the neighbouring settlement to the east, which is Haxby and Wigington, so it's a similar setback from the ring road.
Mr. Smeeden.
If I could just make a small point regarding boundaries. Undoubtedly, you'll have made a site visit and seen that some of the boundaries are discernible clearly as rather scrappy hedges, so they're not particularly strong boundaries.
Just to be clear, I haven't yet, but I will be doing.
When you do. And I have no difficulty with the fact that these boundaries could be improved. I am slightly concerned that as these boundaries are meant to be clear and permanent, that the applicant may rely on land outside the proposed allocation in terms of the areas going to remove from the green belt. It appears to me that there's an intention to have recreational facilities and SUDS associated facilities outside the currently proposed allocation boundary. Were this to happen, I think there's a very great danger that there would be a lack of clarity in what the Greenbelt boundary might have. And in fact, even though some of these might not be inappropriate of themselves in the Greenbelt, they may require sports pavilions, pumping stations, bunding of SUDS features in order to maintain water above the water table. And I think that it's a little unsatisfactory that we don't have a proposed boundary that includes all the associated paraphernalia of this development within the boundary, which would allow the outer boundary then to remain clear and well-defined for the whole plan period, which again is another requirement expressed in the NPF.
Mrs. Worthington?
So I'm just trying to find the key views document that York have cited, and it's very clear from it. I can't put my hands to it at the moment. It's very clear from it, however, that the views are going out from the centre of the city rather than from outside into the city. It's the historic appraisal topic paper, I think, but it's from quite early in the plan, and it relates to the historic settlement of York. And the views clearly are arrows going out from York Minster Tower. One specifically goes to the White Horse. One goes to Crake Castle. It doesn't go from Crake Castle to the Minster. And I can't put my finger on that document to draw it to your attention, but York specifically cited it in various Greenbelt issues at phase 2 level. And it's from the York Central Historic Core Conservation Area appraisal.
And do you have the reference of that for me?
I can get it.
We're having a quick search for it, so sorry.
So I don't know if you'd like us to assist, because this is the document we talked about yesterday. It's SD 103, but I think only the executive summaries. Is it 102? So
104.
104 now. There you go. Joe was close.
Yes,
Is
it's
that
actually...
Is that the plan showing the views?
So
Yeah.
SD 103 is the heritage topic paper which informs the Greenbelt methodology, which was covered in phase 2. The document being referred to, I believe, is document SD 104, which is a different document. It's the conservation area character appraisal.
Is there a particular page I should look at in there?
I can inform in terms of SD3, the heritage topic paper. The page that you review in terms of the views on that is page 7. Sorry, page 57, apologies. PDF page.
The views from the Minster plan, which is in the original conservation area appraisal, are only in relation to the local area. You'll find that in that's CD 104, and that's the conservation area appraisal, and that's at page PDF. Oh God, 11, page 11. Thank you.
Okay, if we are done with Greenbelt and views points, or is someone else wants to say something? It's Ms. Garcia, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct, sir. Thank you. I think there's been a lot of confusing discussion just then about key views, etc. It's not difficult. There are no key views identified from the Minster. The documents referred to in the submissions on behalf of Mr. Harrison are derived from a plan taken from the 2021, it's EX-CYC 59A, the 2021 Greenbelt Addendum Evidence Base. That's figure 13A, the Central Historic Core Views Analysis, Long Distance Views. Now that figure is annotated as being derived from the York Central Historic Core Conservation Area Appraisal, which, as we know, there is no full document of that uploaded within the evidence base, unfortunately. But I can give you some references within that document in any case if and when you do get hold of it. It's derived from the figure on page 68 of the Conservation Area Appraisal, which clearly identifies the views that were discussed as key views, in inverted commas, because they aren't key views. They're key views from the White Horse and from Crake towards the Minster. The Conservation Area Appraisal text accompanying the description of those key views on pages 73 and 74 of the Conservation Area Appraisal are clear in that these are views of the Minster from those locations, talking about the silhouette, basically. How you can see the silhouette of the Minster and the view from Crake is actually because of its historic significance rather than a particular view of the Minster. So I didn't want you to be misled into thinking that those are views that have been identified in other documents within the evidence base as key. They are not. It is views from those locations towards the Minster, not from the Minster towards those locations.
And you'll see the same point is made in the Greenbelt Addendum, CYC 59A, figure 13A, PDF 23. It says the York Central Historic Core Conservation Area identifies 26 key views, including long distance views from the higher ground from the wider setting of the city, which is the same point.
Okay, thank you. Is that a legacy indication, Ms. Worthington? Your nameplate's up. Okay, thank you. Very good. On the point about drainage, did the council want to say anything on that?
The point was only derived from the 2014 document, which was drainage for a site of over 4,000 houses. You will see from my favourite Appendix K, that I gave you the references from earlier, that in fact the boundaries were redrawn to remove flood risk areas from the allocation. So it's not anticipated to be an issue here. It might have been an issue for a site that was 4 times the size, but not for this site.
When you say flood risk areas, Mr. Elvin, we're talking about surface water, are we? Yes, as promised. I can't see your name plate, and I also can't remember your name either. Do forgive me.
Keith Emmett. Thank you.
And also, I didn't hear that. Could you say it again?
Sorry, my name's Keith Emmett. So just to interject with regards to the surface water potential issues, there are some surface water flow paths crossing the site, as you heard on pretty much quite a few sites across the UK. These are dealt with either you contour them around the site or through the site due to through the development in an appropriate fashion. This is part of the detailed design and is not abnormal in any way, shape or form. In terms of the ground conditions that may lead to this, there seems to be interspliced sand and clay layers. So again, you would identify areas where you do maybe have a bit more surface water coming across the site by looking at a hydrogeological solution of water, again, travelling through, and that is obviously something that can be given an engineering solution, which again is perfectly normal for any new development. So were there any other issues that needed to be raised on that point?
Ms Fern.
Thank you, sir. We're not denying that there will be an engineering solution to any drainage problems. There always is. It's the matter of how much that will cost and whether it will be feasible, absolutely. But it goes into the viability testing and also the impact as well, given that we're talking about a site surrounded by green belt, including important historic views, etc. The problem is that, like I say, the impact. So any solution that the developers are going to put forward is inevitably based on our observations of the site. So the flood risk assessment that was submitted by the developers, they didn't actually go out on site. The Google images that we've provided within our evidence clearly show a large extent of surface water within one of the fields. Our client lives next door and has land of a similar level to the site and has a huge lake within his property that he doesn't struggle to maintain. I mean, our client, I'm sure, would have been willing to go and do borehole testing, etc. themselves to determine the groundwater level, but that's not something that we should be doing as part of, assisting the developers and the council in determining that this is acceptable. And obviously we wouldn't have access to the land anyway. So unfortunately, we don't have any concrete evidence. All we have is experience of somebody that lives immediately adjacent to the site. And it's regularly known that when you drive along the outer ring road, it's clear over numerous months of the year that the site is underwater in various positions. Now the developer's flood risk assessment provides no evidence, as stated in our bullet point document that we submitted this morning, provides no evidence to suggest that it's acceptable. And having had comments from us for a significant length of time now, nothing has been done to demonstrate that it's not an issue. And the viability situation, given that it is so marginal, we would have thought that there'd be more concrete evidence provided to determine that there won't be any issues and that significant mitigation measures, such as either a pumping situation or a significant raising of the levels of land, won't be necessary, particularly given that things like raising the land, etc., are going to have knock-on effects on the visibility of the site and how it impacts on the historic nature of York. Thank you.
Okay, I'll hear from you then. I'll see if the council has anything else it wants to add in light of what we've heard, and then I'm going to move on from the drainage point, please.
Thank you, sir. So in terms of the pictures that were taken of the site, whenever you have ponding of water, especially when it's surface water, depends on the time of the year. It depends on any rainfall events that would have happened beforehand and cumulative events. So the problem with the extent of a surface water ponding is circumstantial on the historic events and meteorological situations leading up to that, and at what time and what period of the year. So unless you have images of every month of the same area to be able to identify whether there's an issue or not, you cannot just take a single point in time and say, yes, it extends to this amount. It may give you a worst case, possibly, but then is it similar to a national flood event? Such as, say, 2007, there were properties in Sheffield that were underneath water, and in Gloucester. So again, I'd say with the images, it's going to be very much circumstantial to the events leading up to when that picture was taken.
Yeah, I have the point that any image I'm ever shown only represents a snapshot, almost literally, in time.
So I don't want to prolong this any further, but since somewhat perversely, having said we're not relying on the documents that were put in relation to 2014, it's been relied upon by the objector. To the extent you consider it necessary, can I just suggest, if you want to confirm the position, you can see the site boundaries in relation to the flood risk area, the flood map, in the 2014 flood risk assessment, and you can see just how big the site was. It went right up to the ring road.